Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. It's wonderful to have all of you here. We're going to get started. And thanks also to everyone who's joining in from across the country on the live stream as well. Great to have you tuning in. I'd like to begin by recognizing that we are gathered here today in Ottawa, part of the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And as always, Canada 2020 is grateful to be part of this land's continued history of sharing and exchange, and to hopefully build on that with the conversation today. I'm Braden Cayley, President and CEO of Canada 2020, and as some of you will have heard me say before, for 18 years now, Canada 2020 has been committed to helping build a progressive future for Canada and helping shape a more progressive world. Through events, research, podcasts, and so much more, we've built a network of progressive ideas and people that help shape policy, conversations like this one, and most importantly, action. Our sustaining partners and dedicated leaders in our network, like so many of you, make all of this work possible throughout the year. And today, I also want to extend a very special thank you to the Dais at Toronto Metropolitan University, our partners on today's event, offering essential leadership on these issues as well, including democracy protection and sharing in so much of Canada 2020's mission of building a fairer, more prosperous, and more progressive future for Canada and the world. Now, 2024 will go down as one of the world's biggest election years ever, with approximately 2 billion people heading to the polls. That means nearly half the people on Earth live in countries that will hold national elections this year. And no election will have impacts echo more widely, of course, than the United States of America, our closest ally and economic partner anywhere in the world. It was just 2 years ago, later this spring, that Canada 2020 was fortunate to host Secretary Janet Yellen, one of the first cabinet-level visits of the Biden administration to Canada in Toronto, and just a year ago this month, when we hosted the post-summit reception for President Biden's visit with the Canadian American Business Council, which became one of the largest Canada-US events in Ottawa in many years, not hosted by the US Embassy. And that's because here in Canada, American politics and government have a very real effect on our lives, not just culturally, but in shared security, economic, and climate landscapes, to name just a few. And while Super Tuesday this week didn't have too many surprises, I know that many in this room will be tuned in tonight for the State of the Union address, where President Biden will continue to make the case for the success of his presidency, and we can presume the protection of democracy in the United States and beyond, and the value of a bold, progressive agenda. Today, we're very fortunate to have a special guest uniquely positioned to speak on just this, and on many of the corollary questions, and I'm sure you're all anxious to hear from her. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the former Special Assistant to the President, Senior Speechwriter for President Barack Obama, and Senior Fellow with the Dais at Toronto Metropolitan University, Sarada Peri. Please give her a warm welcome. All right. Thank you so much for being here. We're really happy actually to have you back.
Yes.
Sarada had been with Canada 2020 in 2019 for an event that looked ahead to a lot of the 2020 cycle, and so it's great to be able to have you here once again, translating so much of what is on many of our minds as we face yet another election cycle. But let's talk about that cycle and also what's led into it, and start with a little bit of your assessment, how the campaign maybe is shaping up so far in a week that has had Super Tuesday, even if it didn't count for as much as it may have in the past, but also where the Biden administration has gone so far itself, 3.5 years into it, and what that's meant for you as an American with the experience that you have in the White House and otherwise.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. It is a very stressful week in Washington, so I'm absolutely thrilled to not be there and be here with all of you fine people. So, you know, Super Tuesday was not a surprise. And we ended up with the race, the rematch, that it seems like nobody really wants, but here we are. That said, I think the Biden administration has an incredible record to run on. He has presided over the most job growth. We have record low unemployment, record high GDP. He has passed historic bipartisan legislation, including the biggest investments in climate that we've ever made. He has restored America's leadership in the world after a period of time where countries really didn't know whether they could count on America. And at the same time, he's defended some real progressive priorities, including reproductive rights and abortion. And so, there's just a whole range of issues the Biden administration can run on a really strong record. And now, I think there was sort of a feeling that in the fall especially, where was the campaign? And that was in part just by design because Trump wasn't officially the nominee. Now that we have a nominee, you're seeing the campaign kind of really gin up. They're being far more aggressive than they have been up until now. And I think you're going to see them make a really strong case, including tonight, for his reelection. That said, we are in an incredibly polarized country, as you all know. And the truth is that party tribalism is real. And the unfavorability that you're seeing of President Biden, some of that is just baked into the cake of polarization. So, look, I'm worried. And I'm also optimistic that they've got a really strong record to run on. So we'll see what happens.
Well, and you mentioned tonight in the State of the Union address, and obviously speech writing is such a hallmark of your own career and communications more broadly, of which tonight is one of the ultimate megaphones of that in American democracy. So can you share for us a little bit of what it's like to shape the rhetoric and the message strategy for an opportunity like that, where you're speaking not just to all of the United States Congress at a key moment with an election just 6 or 7 months away, but of course to the American people and to the world with the choices of this year now in a much clearer level of perspective?
Well, from the perspective of a speech, the State of the Union is a nightmare because, when you deliver a speech, when you write a speech, you want it to be a message, a sort of clear message that is persuasive and compelling, that tells a story. And unfortunately, because the State of the Union is by definition the president's message to Congress on how things are going, it is inevitably a laundry list of priorities. And so, every year the president, when I was in the White House, the president would say, this year we're going to make it a story and it's going to be 20 minutes. And of course, that's impossible and it's going to be over an hour long. It's always consequential, and I think we're going to talk about the media, but in part because the media is basically forced to cover this speech. And so for one of the few times, Americans are going to tune in more than they typically do. So President Biden has this opportunity to deliver his message, but it's also, so it has to be both a state of what's going on, but also him laying out the marker for what he's going to propose for 2024. And really, this is the kickoff, I would say, from my perspective, of the campaign. So the stakes are really high. That said, I think maybe more than for most states of the union and for most presidents, what's going to be really important here is, yes, the words, but maybe even more the performance of it. People are going to be looking to see how Biden performs this speech. And I think what they want to see is him coming out swinging like he did last year.
Well, and we can't talk about message strategy without talking about the media, as you did a little bit, and how they're forced to cover it. But there are some that are not, and there are, of course, new ways that aren't so much about coverage as about channels through which a message is received. Of course, now as we move through the 2024 campaign, and a campaign that, like each of the ones progressively over the last 4, is going to be one of the most online, or certainly the most online campaign that we will have seen so far. So I would ask about a different kind of media, and Canadians have been no stranger to a large-scale array of further right media ecosystem, whether it's been what we've seen from Rebel or voices like Jordan Peterson from Canada, but certainly in the US, and they've often been hand in glove, others like Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan or even Elon Musk. Elon Musk met with President Trump earlier this week in West Palm Beach, I understand. So I'm curious on your take about the American progressive media ecosystem right now. Is there one?
Yeah. What's tricky about this, well, let's just back up for a second. So the right-wing media ecosystem, you all know about it, and it has been building for years. It is incredibly powerful and well-funded, but it has really become an arm of the Republican Party, and of course, even more so deeply in the Trump years. So if the Republican Party sees the right-wing media as its arm, then of course it is going to be well-funded and supported and able to saturate this space. But on the Democratic side sees the mainstream media as its where it puts out its message. And of course the mainstream media is not biased. People say that there may be disproportionately larger numbers of liberal reporters, but that's not really what comes out in the news. So if one party is relying on its own propaganda, and the other party is relying on the good faith of reporters to just report its message, that's not going to happen. And so there has been a slight growth of progressive media. Attempts have been made, but nothing has ever really stuck. I would say Crooked Media, which is a media company that was started by some of former President Obama's speechwriters and press staff, has done a pretty good job, I would say, of building up some kind of ecosystem, and I think you're going to continue to see that. But the truth is, we're far from having the kind of ecosystem that the right wing has. That said, I do think that Democratic electeds, including this White House, are doing a better job of moving past the mainstream media, not depending on earned media to get out its message. And you're seeing that actually just, I think it was either yesterday or today, the Biden White House is meeting with a bunch of influencers and internet personalities and sort of the media ecosystem of the social media to get out its message, to talk about the State of the Union. And that, to me, is the way to do it, because you can't rely on the traditional media to get out our messages. That's not their job.
Well, and maybe let's just expand on that a little bit too, because it was another Canadian, as many in the audience will be familiar, Marshall McLuhan, who had said the medium is the message. And as you've addressed, the Biden administration, I think, has gone to some very good lengths to get to different personalities of influence online and work with them where there are shared interest or issue priorities to get that out, and some lighthearted ones too. Today, for instance, I encourage everyone to take a look. He was with a whole bunch of people who had played presidents on TV, asking them for advice on delivering a State of the Union. But where do you think they can bring meaning to that phrase? We've now heard a lot of politics of we need to go where people are. Someone who's a veteran campaigner recently said to me, we need to go where people are, but if you show up wearing a suit and everyone else is wearing a bikini, it's not going to be very effective. How do you go where people are in a way that is really meaningful, you think, to get a message out from an occasion like tonight or otherwise?
I think there's multiple challenges here, but already it's about playing to your strengths, right? So President Biden is somebody who, when he's with people, normal people, does very well. And he is a retail politician. And he doesn't need to try to be somebody he's not. He just needs to be himself with different audiences through the mediums and the channels that they are at. So, for example, if he wants to reach young people, he doesn't need to pretend to be young and cool. He just needs to be himself, but reaching them in the channels that they access and using language that is authentic to him, which is pretty, plain spoken. So I think there's that element of it. I think the challenge generally, though, in this environment is that you've got the need to reach people through these channels outside of the mainstream media. But the mainstream media is still setting the broader narrative, and you can't escape that. So yes, maybe the average person isn't reading the New York Times, but the way that those major outlets kind of shape how people think about politics is real. And so you have to find a way to do both, which is a huge challenge.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think with that, we can maybe shift some gears into some of the policy impacts on the election. And I should add, by the way, we will have the opportunity for all of you in the audience to ask questions as well, so start thinking of that. And in a few minutes' time, we'll move to the chance for our team to bring you a microphone and ask some of those. But there's been a lot of reporting about a potentially sizable number of progressive or younger-leaning Americans who have been dissatisfied with the Biden administration on a few different areas, most pronounced recently around his positions on a ceasefire or not and the kind of calls made for such with respect to Gaza. We had seen that there was a 13% vote for uncommitted in Michigan. There were many similar votes, results in the Super Tuesday results that we saw this week. Now, you could argue, so did the Obama 2012 primary campaign see some similar results at different times. But how much do you think that dynamic is a threat to Biden as he looks toward the general election or not?
In my mind, the discontent that was registered, in Michigan, in Minnesota, in different places, is a really important signal, right? It is, you're hearing from some of these organizers who say, we supported President Biden, and this is our way of signaling this is a problem that you need to address. So in a way, I know that people were frustrated by that, by the numbers, and frustrated by people saying that they were voting uncommitted and actually voting uncommitted. But from my perspective, it was actually a really important signal. It's what your friends do when they give you a warning. So I also think that the strategy of those organizers has in fact pushed the administration, the administration will say that they've been pushing Israel to take a different tack for quite some time, but they've been doing it quietly. Now you're seeing it come out more in the open. So this week, Vice President Harris was very explicit about calling for an immediate ceasefire. You have not seen that yet. And the reporting is that she has been sort of calling for this internally for a long time, and now finally she said the quiet part out loud. And I have to credit the people who were organizing and speaking out for that. I do think that in general there is some progressive discontent that goes beyond Gaza, and the fact that young people don't seem excited and motivated is in fact a problem. The enthusiasm gap is real. So you could argue that Trump has just a numerical ceiling in the number of people who will support him. However, if we have an enthusiasm gap, if we can't turn out the same coalition that won Biden, that voted for Biden in 2020, we're going to have a problem. So it's going to be incumbent upon this campaign to really reach out to those young people and say that they're being heard. And the truth is, again, they've got a record to run on, right? So they've just, working on reducing student debt. They've forgiven student debt for huge numbers of students. They're working on basically making the cost of living something that's easier for working families, all these things that young people care about. So they just have to get out. I mean, I'm not one of those people who says, if we just tell people what we did, they're going to vote for us. I don't actually think that's true. But I do think that the polling shows that people don't know anything about President Biden's accomplishments. And young people don't know that what he's doing is fighting for them. That's really what people want to hear, and they want to see him have some fight. So that's going to be the challenge going forward. And my hope is that if they can communicate back to these communities that we are hearing what you're saying, we are trying to address what your concerns are. And in the case of something like Gaza, it is just super complicated. But we're trying that could potentially get some folks back. You're not going to get everybody back, but you could get some people back.
Well, and I think probably it's especially true for younger generations, but a rule that I've often had with political speeches too would be dividing a bit of a formula where, if it's 6 pieces, 1 about your record and where you've come, 2 about what people are facing and feeling today, and 3 the future and what's at stake and what's possible for them too. And it sounds like that's a lot of what you think young people need to hear more of going forward as well.
I do, and I also think, and again, I think you're going to start to hear this tonight and clearly going forward, the contrast is really, really important, because the alternative is a Donald Trump who doesn't care about anybody but himself, right? And so what he is calling for is a turn backwards 60 years, as Biden says, and the things that he wants to do we think that he's going to implement policies that will actually help young people? No. What his plans are, he's the one who appointed Supreme Court justices to overturn Roe v. Wade. He's the one who passed a giant tax cut for his rich friends and corporations. All these things that are actually incredibly unpopular, while you have President Biden who's reducing the cost of insulin and trying to forgive people student debt. Just a really clear contrast. So they just need to go hard on that, which they are absolutely going to do, and we need to reach young people where they are.
Well, on that alternative is perhaps where we can take a little bit of a darker turn for a moment and indulge our anxieties perhaps a little bit.
Group therapy.
Yes, we've already touched the surface on a few of the possibilities of the prospects for threats that a second Trump presidency may present to Americans or the world, whether it's things like on national security, international partnerships, women's rights, queer rights, trans rights specifically, democracy protection itself, independence of the judiciary, climate. We could go on. But what worries you, the most? What do you think your fellow Americans are most anxious about on the progressive side of things when they think about what this really could be in terms of a second Trump presidency, if that was the result of this campaign in November?
All of the things that you mentioned are deeply concerning, and also equally concerning, as I'm sure you all, feel as our friendly northern neighbors, is that the trend of authoritarianism around the world is deeply troubling, right? So you're seeing all over the world strong men like Narendra Modi in India or Viktor Orban in Hungary, just all of these people who are gaining power is deeply problematic. So and then of course all the individual issues can keep us all up at night and do keep me up at night. Right. I would say more broadly though, I keep going back to January 6th, and I keep going back to the fact that after, 200 years, we did not actually have a peaceful transfer of power. It is not a peaceful transfer of power if people die in the Capitol, right? If police officers were attacked by a marauding mob of people egged on by a president who refuses to acknowledge the legitimate winner of an election, and whose supporters still do not acknowledge that the 2020 election results were legitimate. They still don't. And so when I think about what could happen in November and beyond, it is, first of all, if Joe Biden wins, do we think that Donald Trump is going to go quietly into the night? What havoc will he wreak? The fact that there are sitting Republican members of Congress who have said they acquitted him in part because they faced threats of violence, and their families did too. So we're in a real sort of crisis from that perspective. But then if he does win, what happens then? You know, I am your retribution. This is what he says. This is the kind of, what he has promised going forward is something really terrifying. And so, and I don't see how you get out of it from that, at that point. Once he's in, how do we get out? So I don't mean to be dark, but I think we're in a really dangerous spot. And it's interesting because I think some of what you're seeing in terms of discontent on the left, within the Democratic Party, frustration that we have a rematch, it's because the energy within the Democratic Party, I think, is ready to really move forward, move beyond this generation, start pushing for real progressivism, address challenges like climate. But we are locked in this cycle of just trying to survive, just wresting our democracy from this crazy man and his supporters. And at some point, it just feels like, come on. You know, we want something different, but we can't have it right now. We cannot have nice things right now. And not that Joe Biden is not a nice thing. I think he's been an excellent president. You know, I don't agree with him on everything. Frankly, I am really unhappy with what's happening in Gaza. But I still think he has been an excellent president, and he's somebody I support. That said, I understand why there is a frustration with this feeling like, why are we doing this again? And the truth is, we have to keep doing this until we deal with this threat. Sorry, the last thing I'll say about this, clearly you can tell I feel strongly, is that, you know, we talk a lot about Trump and Trumpism, whatever that might mean. But I, in a way, feel like we are all beholden to and paralyzed by Trump's supporters. It is his supporters who have put us in this situation where individual people have all this outsized power, where, you know, the Supreme Court might rule in a certain way because they are worried about political violence. Where, I mean, yes, Trump eggs it on, but he has created a group of people, or maybe that group of people was always going to evolve in this direction. I feel strongly that the Republican Party laid a very clear path to where we are. But those people are a problem, and we have to figure out how to undo that. We have to figure out how to actually grapple with it and not just say Trump, Trump, Trump. Yes, he is, of course, the manifestation of the problem and the, you know, leader of the problem, but there are a whole huge number of people in our country who are going along with it, and we have to solve that.
Well, and that rings true. I think that it's you know, a dynamic of polarization towards further right in many communities that we've seen globalized far beyond a Trump-only, America-only context as well.
Here too, right?
Yes, there's many edges of that here as well. In fact, there was one Abacus poll that I think only a month ago found that support for Trump amongst young men in Canada was comparable or perhaps higher than it was in the United States, which was jarring to many people. I will, you know, you've touched on the domestic security threat that can come from the democracy threat that may be posed by that kind of result in the United States. I'm going to broaden that to the international security aspects to it. Just a few weeks ago, former President Trump had encouraged Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want, quote, to NATO members that he thought are not paying their fair share. You know, and you know, there are questions about defense spending in many NATO countries, and not to excuse his comment in the absolute slightest, but you know, in fact, according to an Angus Reid poll released earlier this week, 53% of respondents in Canada had said Canada should increase its military spending level to 2% of GDP in alignment with the NATO benchmark. That support jumped to 65% when the idea of a second Donald Trump presidency was was introduced to the question and factored in. What would you say are the risks internationally, whether that's in Europe or more specifically to a country like Canada, who shares not just the world's largest undefended border, but so many, as I said in the opening, cultural and economic ties and landscapes with the United States and its people?
I think the challenge with someone like Trump and the danger for everybody is I guess, maybe just the more extreme version of what we saw last time, where you guys can't count on us anymore, right? We're supposed to be able to count on each other. And for decades, we have had this relationship. And the notion that we would not be able to support Canada the way Canada supports us, the way we always have, is, I think, really terrifying. And I take your point about NATO. I mean, I think what's so interesting about Trump is that he sort of touches on this truth and just goes too far with it. So sure, we can say that other NATO member states should be spending more of their GDP on defense, and that is something that's really popular when he says it to Americans. And yet, it is an incredibly important investment for America to make in NATO and specifically in Ukraine, right, to prevent any sort of further incursion and to protect us, all of us. And the absence of that and the fact that he is, he comes off as this sort of strongman, but he's actually very weak. And when he is in power, sort of going along with these people like Putin and Xi Jinping demonstrates his weakness, just makes the rest of us seem really weak too. And so I think our allies, like Canada, understand this clearly. And I think it's why everybody is watching this election with bated breath and terror. But I think that threat is real. And I don't, I worry about the sort of, it's not just comedy. It is these alliances that we depend on that are not perfect, of course, and that there are evolutions that need to be had, and yet the idea that this one person and his ideology could sort of collapse that at a time when other ideologies are attractive, when someone like Narendra Modi is really doing well and incredibly popular, is troubling.
Well, and then maybe let's move off Trump at least a little bit then to speak about some of that broader global context. And there's a lot going on in the world beyond the US election, as much as that is the bulk of our conversation today. As I mentioned on the way in, we've got elections in Mexico, India, over 15 African countries, 15 European countries, including the United Kingdom. Something our advisory board chair, Mark Carney, has said is that this is a time of great rewirings, right? We are seeing global trade networks and partnerships being rewired after what we've seen in the pandemic and in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. You're seeing our energy systems rewired with the green transition and moving to net zero, and now intelligence itself being rewired. And so for that to be taking place as we're having the world's biggest election year, what do you think is important about that for voters to be thinking about in the lens of a progressive agenda? It's a pivotal moment for many ways, not just the outcome of the US election that we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a national security expert, and you can find people who are far smarter on policy than I am, so I will just talk about this from a communications perspective. There has been a level of fear and anxiety around the rapid changes that have been happening in the world. And frankly, they haven't been all that rapid, right? I mean, I remember when I was in college in the 90s, everybody protesting the World Trade Organization. So this has been going on for a long time. I think where progressives need to step up is in offering an affirmative vision of what this world can look like, where everybody can find a place for themselves, as opposed to just sort of saying, these forces are after us and we must just push them off, as though there's any chance of that happening. There isn't. So what are we offering? What are we saying that we want this world order to look like? What potential rules of the road do we want all of us to sign up to as allies? What do we expect of the tech companies that are making a whole lot of money off of our data, among other things? And what can we say we believe it should look like? people are desperate for some kind of vision. And it can't just be defensive. It can't just be not that. And I don't think that's just true of our countries in the West. I think that's true everywhere. And so I would hope that all of our sort of progressive communities and, we all work together, right? There are alliances between Canada 2020 and progressive organizations in the US. I'm here as part of the Dais, which is this, working really hard to bring together people across our borders. I think all of us, it's incumbent upon all of us to offer that. And I feel like there's a lot of work to do on that.
Absolutely. And I'll say that in about 3 or 4 minutes, we'll start to take some audience questions. So you can begin to raise your hand to Carolyn, our Director of Operations back here, or Mark, I think, is still right over here as well. So raise your hands to them and they'll begin to get microphones ready for you. But on that note about, and maybe you've partially answered this, but how can we make sure, especially younger generations, but everyone, feel like democracy is delivering for them in a positive way, not only a defensive way? We've seen some troubling research in the United States and in many countries, democracies amongst the G20, that younger generations don't necessarily believe to the same degree that democracy is the best system of government, which of course is a red flag in allowing much of the track to be laid for the kinds of problems and threats to it that we've talked about today. So how do we communicate to people about democracy delivering and making life better for people?
Well, it has to actually deliver for them.
Yeah.
It's not just enough to communicate it to them. I've been thinking a lot about President Franklin Roosevelt and the 1932 election. So this is the height of the Great Depression. Exactly. Sort of it's at the height of the Great Depression, and his Republican predecessor, Herbert Hoover, just was not able to, and did not really believe that government had a role to play in helping people get out of the situation. And he did do some. He gets a bad rep, and he did push government in some directions to sort of provide basic relief to people. But when a quarter of the public is unemployed and hungry, and there are entire communities that are just hollowed out, it's not enough to say, it'll be okay, business will help you, right? And FDR saw this not just as kind of an economic challenge, but at a time when totalitarianism is rising in Europe, he is looking over there and saying, there is something appealing about this ideology, that the state will take care of everything, regardless of the ramifications that come from that. There is something appealing about this. And my campaign and my desire to put in place the New Deal, which it would eventually happen after he won, is yes, an economic issue, but it is also a political issue and an issue of democracy. I have to make sure that people understand that their government does have a role and that we will help. And so, it is not a perfect analogy, but I keep thinking about that because when we need to find a way to, again, with this affirmative vision, build a situation where young people feel like their future is not at stake. I mean, I think about this for myself and for my kids. Are my kids actually going to have a better life than I do when everybody is telling me that AI is going to put us all out of work? That doesn't feel really good. And I feel like I'm a pretty aware person. I pay attention, and I'm not feeling great about the situation. How is somebody who doesn't pay such close attention to politics going to feel about it? Not great. And so, again, rather than just kind of having this doomsday view of things, we need to put forward something that makes people feel like the world we want to build, at least aspirationally, has a place for everybody. Otherwise, I think that some of that negativity isn't just about ourselves and our current lot in life. People are always wondering, the economy is doing really well in the US, why don't people feel good? I think part of that is just this anxiety in the back of your mind that my kids aren't going to do as well. And so addressing that feels really important, and I don't have an answer as to what that should be, but I think it really is incumbent upon us to do it, not just for the sake of the economy, but for the sake of our democracies.
Well, and those kids themselves feeling like they may not be able to get ahead,
absolutely.
Right? If you're a Gen Z and has come of age in the scope of a global financial crisis and then a global health crisis, and I think often of housing as perhaps the ultimate economic issue right now in Canada, so much the United States, other peer countries where people simply don't feel they have the access too much of the time to what even their parents' generation may have had, or their grandparents' generation. And so clearly that's a big challenge for all persuasions, but progressives to be grappling with too. Do we have any questions yet from the audience? Oh, it actually looks like we have a lot. So we'll begin with there and get started with some of your takes. If you could just introduce yourself before you start, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Anush Turjanian from the Human Rights Center at the University of Ottawa. And I was the founding director of the Anxieties of Democracy program at the Social Science Research Council.
It's working, but maybe quietly if we can turn it up.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry. And I actually wanted just to ask you a little bit about this point about 60 years ago, why we don't want to go backwards 60 years ago. But a lot of these voters for Trump, who you consider, I think rightly, the N factor, would love to go back to 60 years ago. It's the moment that Ira Katznelson called when affirmative action was white. There were homes, there was funded education, there was a very nice and good and secure lifestyle. So how do we speak to precisely, and I'm thinking right now at this moment with the current data set that we have in front of us, we can't fix the democracy. How do we speak to, for example, the Haley voters? What is the best way to move away from the talk to the hand, right? And to ensure that, because we used to joke at the program that the biggest voting bloc in the 2016 election was non-voters, right? So this risk that this group of people may or may decide not to vote at all, and is there a way to make the bridge and to actually respectfully bring people over and to meet them where they are?
Well, the Haley voters are a complicated bunch, and not necessarily people who are going to come to our side. And candidly, if they are not on our side and they want to stay home, have at it. That's fine. What the 60 years ago piece that I was specifically thinking about, not just from an economic perspective, is really about rights. So most of America, I don't know if it's because the narratives are shaped by men or what, but there's always been this notion that abortion is really controversial. It's kind of not. Majorities of Republicans even basically favor Roe v. Wade. And once you took that away, Republicans are now in a box. They are in a box on this issue. The Alabama Supreme Court they said that embryos, frozen embryos, are considered people, which actually meant that the University of Alabama and other fertility clinics halted IVF treatments. You know what's really popular? IVF treatments. And so they are just in this box on that issue. And so from my perspective, I think that we just need to be going hard on this idea that there are a group of people who are completely out of touch with the lived experience of most families, that they don't actually care about our families. And I think that we need to go hard on taking back the word freedom. So for a long time, the right wing has co-opted this notion of freedom. I'm not exactly clear how it happened, but it's done. It's over. Because what they are doing is instead taking away our freedom to control our own bodies. They are taking away freedom to control our own families and decide how our families live. The freedom to raise our children how we wish. The freedom to read books that are available in our free public libraries. The freedom to vote. The freedom to make sure that my kids can go to school without being shot. There are a range of issues on which they have completely abdicated this most fundamental American value. So I think that there is huge opportunity there to craft that as our sort of guiding message. And with that comes a kind of economic freedom. Not to, again, harken back to FDR, but that's really what that is about. The idea that I don't need to, that I'm not beholden to corporations and wealthy people, but that everybody has the right to make it in this country. Our country, sorry, not your country too, but
this country too.
all of our countries. And so, and again, what that is, it's not just against something, it is for something. And using freedom as a kind of an affirmative value that drives us. You always want to start with the value. Let's take that value back.
Thank you. Maybe let's take 2 questions in a row next, and over to you.
Hi, thank you for being here, Ms. Perry. My name is Chris Fraser. I'm a former federal public servant here in Ottawa. So my question is, many progressives in the United States are cheering on the attempt to get the former president off the ballot as a way to protect democracy. But isn't that actually a contradiction? Because if you try to take somebody off the ballot, you're denying people the right to vote for that person. So that seems like a contradiction that progressives need to deal with.
I actually don't think progressives need to deal with it because it's going to be a moot point. The Supreme Court is not going to allow that. But I would say 2 things to that. So I just think it's not going to be an actual issue that we need to, that will come up and that anybody needs to make a decision on, because the Supreme Court will decide it. But what was really interesting in the Supreme Court case is that a group of historians wrote an amicus brief explaining actually why the Insurrection Act does in fact disqualify, would in fact, if they are true originalists, there were enough cases basically after the Civil War, Reconstruction, and leading even into the late 1890s, cases of officials who were not allowed to run because they had incited or provided aid and comfort to insurrectionists. And so from that perspective, these historians argued that it is kind of a cut and dried case vis-a-vis Donald Trump. However, it's not going to be an issue. So because the Supreme Court is saying that it's not an issue. So I think that it's actually not something that progressives necessarily have to grapple with publicly because it's a moot point.
All right, do we have a next question? I see one here and one here.
Hi, Tim Sargent from the Centre for the Study of Living Standards.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Tim Sargent from the Centre for the Study of Living Standards. I think the Republicans have made it pretty clear they're going to run hard on international migration. How do you think the president's going to handle that issue between now and November?
I would say immigration and the border situation on our southern border is one of President Biden's biggest liabilities. However, the Republicans did hand him a gift when they demanded a border security bill with no inclusion of immigration reform, which used to be a bipartisan issue, by the way. In return, they would support aid to Ukraine, Israel, and aid to the Palestinians. They crafted, and President Biden said, sure, do it. They wrote a bill, and then they tanked their own bill. Why? Because Donald Trump said, I don't want you to pass this bill because I need this as a political issue. So the message then is Republicans say there's a problem, say they want to solve the problem, wrote the bill themselves, and then tanked it, leaving our border unsecure for the sake of politics. Who's really on your side? So it's not going to be easy, and the Biden administration, is doing what it can, but the truth is that this is such a complicated issue, as I'm sure it is here. And the system, our immigration system is just so fundamentally broken. And Biden is actually tacking far more to the center than our progressives would have us do, but it's in part because the situation has just become so challenging. So it's not great. It's an enormous vulnerability for him, and I think there are some key, clear openings for them to prosecute the case against Republicans on this.
Thank you. And we've got 2, I think, right here, so maybe if we can just take them together for time's sake.
Okay.
Hi, thanks. Jeff Passmore. I run Canada's annual Industrial Bioeconomy Business Conference. And wow, it's so nice to sit here and listen to somebody who's so knowledgeable and articulate. You mentioned all the wonderful accomplishments of Biden, but it's going to come down to image, unfortunately. So what can be done to improve his image? When I watch television, he's walking with a shuffle with his mouth open. This is not the image I want as a president. And my second question related to that is, why is this happening? My generation would love to pass the torch to your generation and have young people running instead of this redo. So why was Biden not convinced to step away? And is it still too late to have somebody tell him that he still needs to do it?
Thanks, Jeff. And quickly, next door, yes?
Yes. This week in France, France enshrined the right to abortion in its constitution. In Canada, about 50 years ago, Dr. Henry Morgan-Tyler, he went to jail and he was persecuted by the justice system of Canada until about 1988, I think it was, when Canada said the federal anti-abortion law was unconstitutional. You said Biden is positive in reproductive rights and abortion. Trump will overturn, instrumental in overturning Roe v. Wade. The Federal Court of the United States is obviously, at least it seems to me, opposed to reproductive rights or women's rights. Should Canada look to the United States for leadership on legal, ethical issues? I'm
Over to you.
Okay, let me go back. Oh, now I'm going to forget the first question, which I should have written down. His image, Biden's image. And yes, why we are being led by a gerontocracy. Okay, so his image. The truth is, he is an older person. I mean, that is just the reality. And I think there are many moments when we see him and he, is maybe appears in a light that is more appealing or seems young. But the truth is, he is just an older person. My take, and again, I think reasonable people can disagree about how to actually handle this. I actually think putting him out there more is better. I'm reminded of something that the American journalist Katie Tour said after the 2016 election. She said, imagine that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are standing next to each other and each of them is wearing a white shirt. On Donald Trump's shirt, there are all these splotches. There's the sex scandals, money scandals, Trump University, racism, Muslim ban, all over him. And you don't know where to look. And on Hillary, on her white shirt, it's just a big splotch of emails, her emails. And you know where to look, and that is the thing that draws you in. And I feel a little bit like that on the age issue with Biden, insofar as if he only is very present nationally every once in a while, then it's easy to let this kind of every incident take an outsized importance. And every move he makes and every time he walks, it seems like it's a big deal. And again, I don't know if this would solve the problem. I don't know the actual solution or the perfect solution, but it does seem to me that having him out there as much as possible, having cameras on him, is a good thing. And so he does, in fact, go around the country and do a lot of rallies and do all these rope lines. He's doing it. He was on Seth Meyers last week. And so he is out there, and I think you'll see that more. And I think, honestly, that just helps. But also, not denying that he's old, which he's not doing. I mean, he makes jokes about it. And I think he needs to do more of that and just sort of say, yes, I am. And that guy's ideas are old. And I want to, I'm doing this for my grandkids. And my ideas are about the future, and I want to make sure we're building the future. But he can't get, there's nothing to be done about this age issue. On your second question, I sort of referenced this earlier, but I think, in 2020, it made a whole lot of sense for him to be the nominee, and he was easy to rally around. And now, I think that he genuinely believes that the New Yorker writer Evan Osnos did a huge profile of him that came out earlier this week, and he genuinely believes that he is the person to beat Donald Trump because he's the only one who has. And that his kind of centrist credentials, having brought along the progressives, give him a level of credibility. And, as David Axelrod, President Obama's longtime political strategist, has said, if Biden was 15 years younger and you took his accomplishments, it would be a, no question would he win this election. So, I mean, I don't have an answer for the gerontocracy, but can I just add one more thing?
Yes.
So I don't really speak sports, but I was watching the Super Bowl, and with my family and friends, and I noticed that the advertisements, the Super Bowl is the American football big to-do. You guys know better than I do. I'm like, that they put the ball in the net. Anyway, And but the advertisements are a really big deal because it's such a large audience. And all of the advertisements, they featured like these very aged actors, just like old dudes. And I was thinking, is this really what everybody wants? Why are these companies hiring these, like, septuagenarians to be their leading men in these ads? It was bizarre. And between that and the Supreme Court with these old men telling me what to do with my body, I think we're all just a little bit over it. Now, to President Biden's credit, he is not, a right-wing kook, and his ideas really are forward-leaning. But it is telling to me that there is something about even outside of politics, although you can see it in politics, these old men just hanging on for dear life because they don't know what's going to happen after, and that's not something that we as voters can control, right? Because of how money in politics works, because of how power works, because they pass it around to each other in every industry, in Hollywood, in finance, in politics, in the media. It's just every industry. It's just these dudes. And so, like, I'm the first person to say let's end this, but it's going to take a little bit more than just me. So, and then to your question.
Still sexy.
And then to your question, I don't know if any country ought to look to another country for moral or ethical guidance. I would say that the people who are making those particular decisions that I find unethical, this idea that an embryo is more of a person than I am, is just profoundly unethical in my view. But to the extent that the U.S. is making these unethical decisions, I will say that they don't necessarily represent a majority of Americans, right? So the Supreme Court at this moment clearly does not represent the majority of Americans. Most Americans are very unhappy with the series of decisions they've made. But that said, would I say that, you guys should listen to us on this issue? No. No, we're going backwards and other countries are going forward, specifically on this issue of reproductive rights. It's very, very frightening.
Well, and we'll begin to wrap up, and I'll bring up Kareem in a moment, but I want to make sure that we do that wrapping up in a solution-oriented way. It's hard to do sometimes when individual action is just a part of what we are discussing in these big challenges, but let's try. And if you had a call to action for progressives, policymakers, strategists, activists, engaged citizens in the United States, in Canada, of how to be better messengers for their values, and their value in facing these challenges and opportunities together, what might that be?
Yeah. This will not be succinct, but I alluded to this earlier. I think it's all well and good for us to kind of engage in group therapy and have a little bedwetting about what's going to happen and our trepidations and our fears about Donald Trump and our anxieties about what's going to happen. It's all well and good, and that's not enough. We also need to put on our big kid pants and fight for the world we want. And if we still believe in democracy, which I think we should, we need to teach our kids why it's important and why it matters in their lives. And we need to, once again, create and develop an affirmative vision for the future we want and then just hammer it home. And not just accept the premises that are offered to us by a right wing that is benefiting from people's cynicism. President Obama always would say that when people feel like the system isn't working for them, then they are by definition going to become cynical and they're not going to participate in the system, which means the system won't work for them, and it just is a cycle. And we have to get out of that. So I think events like this are really important, partnerships like this are really important. Let's get more Canadians and Americans together. But I do think that it is a kind of global call for progressives everywhere to be doing this work together and to offer something that is hopeful and affirmative, that people can look up to and want to be a part of.
Thank you, Sarada. We will keep being resolved to do so much of that work together. I certainly want to thank Carolyn, Aisha, and Mark on our team for their support in making this event happen today, but of course a big thank you to the Dais at Toronto Metropolitan University for presenting it with us. And on that note, I'd like to bring up Kareem to wrap us up today. Kareem is the Executive Director of the Dais at TMU. Welcome to the stage.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I really appreciate this partnership that the Dais has with Canada 2020, especially when we come to Ottawa with our our senior fellows. The Dais is a policy and leadership think tank at TMU, formerly Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University. And we're committed to building shared prosperity and shared citizenship for Canada. And so part of that work involves sharing this hopeful message and the tools that people need to develop their own leadership, to be active citizens, to be positive contributors to the active citizenship, which, as we heard in this discussion, is there's a gravitational pull in the other direction unless we, the coalition and the willing, are involved in this work. And it's detailed work. It's work that happens at the policy level, but and also happens at the level of developing people. And that's what we are. We're a policy and leadership development think tank at TMU. And as part of that, one of the things we do is we have the Senior Fellows Program, and so thrilled that Sarada has been joining us now for the 4th time here, 2nd time on stage at Canada 2020. We were in Toronto and in Brampton earlier this week, reaching out to a wide variety of audiences, and so we're appreciative of you and this audience as well. At Canada 2020, I want to thank Carolyn, Justin, Aisha, Paul, and Mark. Justin's taking a photo right now. Really appreciative to the Canada 2020 audience and this network that you have, not only in Ottawa but elsewhere, curating these really important conversations and creating a community here. And so when we come to Ottawa from our base in Toronto, we're always very appreciative of that. We'd like to invite you to Toronto, however. I just wanted to put in a little plug for Democracy Exchange, which is our Canada's Democracy Summit taking place April 12th and 13th. We just announced a number of guest speakers, democracyexchange.org, or you can look it up on our website, dais.ca. Thanks so much for the partnership. Thank you so much for Sarada. This has been an Ontario tour of engaging a wide variety of audiences, and I think some of the messages that you've captured here in the last hour or so are really important lessons for us around really taking a critical and nuanced perspective on some of the challenges progressives in particular have to tackle, and to not only do the work but come up with some of those narratives that are as yet a bit elusive. So thank you so much for that, and thanks to Braden and to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. So much fun. Thank you. Thank you, Kareem, and thank you, everyone. We'll see you again very soon. Appreciate it.